Is it possible to truly understand someone you never had the chance to meet? My great-grandfather, Alphonse Leroux, died in 1970, 2 years before I was born. Growing up, his story was nebulous, just disconnected fragments of family memory tossed around the room. Stories of a somewhat stern patriarch, an old uniform, a war long past. For a long time, those fragments were all I had. It wasn't until I began a deeper dive into the archives, reconnecting the paper trail with my own art, that the shadow of the man began to take shape. This documentary is an attempt to piece those fragments together, to tell not only the deeply human story of Alphonse, but the story of a young Canada itself, forged in the crucible of the First World War. The Great War. In the working-class town of Terrebonne, Quebec, life was shaped by hard physical labor and the rigid rhythms of Catholic faith. At the center of the Leroux household was Joseph Wilfrid Leroux, born in 1863, who spent his working life as a tailleur de pierre, a stonecutter. Working 48 hours a week for a modest wage at the local quarry, Wilfrid provided for a growing family that would eventually include his wife, Anatole Lapointe, and over a dozen children. Among them was Alphonse, born in 1897. Growing up in Terrebonne, Alphonse was part of a tightly knit French-Canadian Roman Catholic community. The family was literate and bilingual, navigating a society where French was spoken at home and English dominated the broader economy. But as Alphonse reached young adulthood, the quiet life along the Rivière des Mille Îles was shattered by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. When Britain declared war, Canada was automatically drawn into the conflict. Initially, a wave of enthusiasm swept across the country, but the political landscape quickly soured, particularly in French Canada. Sir Sam Hughes, the volatile Minister of Militia and Defence, proved intensely hostile toward French-Canadian culture. Hughes held deep-seated anti-Catholic biases and stubbornly resisted the creation of French-speaking military units. English was mandated as the sole language of command, and Catholic chaplains were initially denied official standing. To make matters worse, recruitment efforts in Quebec were often led by Protestant ministers who preached in English, further alienating the local population. Unsurprisingly, voluntary enlistment in Quebec plummeted. While imperial authorities in Ottawa publicly accused French Canadians of cowardice, the reality was a crisis engineered by systemic prejudice and political mismanagement. Yet, for young men living in industrializing towns like Terrebonne, the pressure was immense. They caught the sneers from English-language newspapers and felt the rising tension between Ottawa and Quebec. Despite the hostility of the military establishment, Alphonse stepped forward to enlist. For a stonecutter son from Terrebonne, joining the Canadian Expeditionary Force, or the CEF as it became known, was not an act of blind allegiance to the British Empire. It was a deeply personal choice, and, perhaps, a quiet act of defiance against a system that made it clear he was not welcome. On July 5, 1915, 18-year-old Alphonse walked into the recruitment depot in Montreal and placed his signature on the line. Assigned Regimental No. 417404, he was taken on strength with the 41st Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force. For Alphonse and the young men filling the ranks of the 41st, basic training in Canada was an exercise in improvisation. The military infrastructure was stretched to its absolute limits. Uniform shortages were rampant, and proper modern Ross rifles were scarce on the drill squares. For weeks, recruits marched in civilian clothes or ill-fitting wool, learning the rudiments of drill, section tactics, and physical conditioning under the sweltering summer sun of Valcartier and Quebec staging grounds. It was the transition into the rigid, uncompromising machinery of imperial military discipline that marked the true transformation. On October 18, 1915, the battalion boarded the troop ship RMS Saxonia in Quebec. A former Cunard ocean liner retrofitted into a crowded gray transport, the ship offered a jarring introduction to life at sea. For 10 days, thousands of men were packed into the damp, claustrophobic lower decks amidst the heavy stench of coal smoke, stale wool, and seasickness. It only made one trip across the Atlantic as a troop ship, ferrying the 41st. This picture was taken when Alphonse was on board. When Saxonia finally docked in England on October 28, 1915, the men were marched off into the biting autumn cold of Hampshire and transported directly to Bramshott. Bramshott was a sprawling tent and hut city built on the damp, rutted military grounds of Hampshire. Instead of the grand heroics of war, Alphonse's initiation to England was defined by cold rain, endless mud, repetitive rifle drills, and the culture shock of an imperial army base. The transition was not without its friction. On November 17, 1915, barely 3 weeks after arriving, Alphonse had his first official run-in with Army authority. Charged with being improperly dressed on parade and absent without leave for 3 hours, he was sentenced to 1 day of Field Punishment No. 2. Field Punishment No. 1, nicknamed crucifixion by the soldiers, entailed labor duties and attachment to a fixed object such as a post or wheel for 2 hours a day. Soldiers viewed Field Punishment No. 1 as particularly degrading. Field Punishment No. 2 differed only in that the soldier was not bound to a fixed object. In the earliest photograph of Alphonse, taken during his initial training in Canada, he is holding a rifle in front of a canvas military tent. His uniform hangs loosely on his frame, almost swallowing his shoulders. His face is round and boyish, his expression wide-eyed and uncertain. He doesn't look like a soldier hardened for war. He looks like a boy playing dress-up in an oversized uniform, clutching a weapon he is still learning to use. By the time he steps into the studio of Bates & Company at Bramshott just months later, that boy is gone. In the second photograph, his entire posture is hardened. His shoulders are filled out and square, the uniform fitting the frame of a man who has undergone grueling physical drill and cross-Atlantic transport. The soft roundness of his face has given way to a broader, heavier jawline, and his eyes no longer carry the tentative softness of the camp photo. In the span of just a few months, the camera captures the rapid, jarring transition forced upon an entire generation, the sudden, irreversible leap from boy to man. In early 1916, the Canadian Expeditionary Force was undergoing a massive structural reorganization on English soil. As casualty rates mounted on the Western Front, the Imperial Command needed a streamlined pipeline to process fresh recruits and funnel them directly into depleted frontline units. On March 15, 1916, Alphonse was transferred from Bramshott to the 23rd Reserve Battalion at Shorncliffe, Kent. Shorncliffe served as the final holding pen and staging ground where soldiers received intense, specialized instruction, live grenade throwing, rapid-fire rifle drills, and gas mask drills before being drafted into active combat. That summon came just 5 weeks later. On April 23, 1916, Alphonse was sent across the Channel to France, reporting to the Canadian-based depot at Le Havre. He was officially posted to the 22nd Battalion, French-Canadian, the famed Vendus, the only purely French-speaking infantry unit in the entire Canadian Corps. On May 14, 1916, Alphonse formally joined the 22nd Battalion in the field. He was marched directly into the Ypres salient in West Flanders, Belgium, one of the most dangerous, low-lying, and heavily shelled sectors on the entire Western Front. When Alphonse arrived, the 2nd Canadian Division was holding a lethal bulge in the line, surrounded on three sides by German high ground. The trenches in the salient were built not into deep earth, but constructed out of waterlogged sandbags and mud, perpetually flooded and exposed to enemy artillery observers. In early June, the sector erupted into total chaos. On June 2, 1916, the German army launched a massive concentrated surprise artillery bombardment, the heaviest experienced by Canadian troops to date, followed by the detonation of several underground mines, triggering the Battle of Mount Sorel. Over 2 weeks of desperate, brutal hand-to-hand fighting, the Canadian Corps fought bitterly to claw back lost ground, enduring over 8,000 casualties in the relentless shelling. Though the primary counteroffensive officially wound down on June 13th, the Ypres salient remained a meat grinder of heavy trench warfare, shell fire, and sniper activity. Just 4 days later, on June 17th, 1916, Alphonse's initial stretch in the front lines came to a violent halt. He was struck in action, sustaining a gunshot wound to his right arm, a common injury caused by high-velocity shrapnel or rifle fire catching a soldier exposed above the parapet. The medical machinery of the CEF swung instantly into motion. Evacuated back through the chain of regimental aid posts and casualty clearing stations, Alphonse was moved to the coast and loaded onto the hospital ship New Haven, bound for England.
Upon landing, he was admitted to the First Eastern General Hospital in Cambridge for surgical treatment.
On paper, he was struck off the active frontline role and transferred to the Casualty Assembly Center, the administrative unit managing sick and wounded personnel. As his arm healed, he was moved on July 14th to the Canadian Convalescent Hospital at Woodcote Park, Epsom, where soldiers underwent physical therapy to regain joint mobility and muscle strength. This picture was taken as he convalesced. Alphonse's recovery was remarkably quick. On July 22nd, just 5 weeks after taking shrapnel to the arm, he was officially discharged from the hospital and posted to the 69th Battalion to rebuild his combat fitness. While Alphonse was recovering in England, the Western Front had shifted into its most violent chapter yet, the Battle of the Somme. The Canadian Corps was being moved south to Picardy to relieve exhausted British units and take part in the catastrophic push toward Courcelette. Knowing his battalion was taking heavy losses in the mud of northern France, Alphonse's time in reserve was brief. On September 21st, he was transferred back overseas. Crossing the Channel for the third time in 5 months, he stepped back onto French soil to rejoin the 22nd Battalion in the field, stepping directly out of convalescence and straight into the pulverized, cratered landscape of the Somme. When Alphonse returned to France in late September 1916, he arrived in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Courcelette. The 22nd had achieved a historic victory in capturing the village, but the cost had been devastating. The Vendus suffered hundreds of casualties, leaving the unit shattered and in desperate need of labor and reorganization. Instead of going directly back to the frontline trenches with his battalion, Alphonse was redirected. On October 6, 1916, he was transferred from the Canadian-based depot to the 2nd Canadian Entrenching Battalion, The entrenching battalion was a hybrid unit that operated as both a combat reserve and a heavy labor force. Stationed in the forward zone behind the lines, these men performed the grueling, unglamorous work that kept the infrastructure of the Western Front from collapsing. As the wet, freezing winter of 1916 settled over northern France, Alphonse's days were defined by back-breaking fatigue parties. He worked 12-hour shifts in cold mud, repairing collapsed trench walls, stringing barbed wire in pitch darkness, laying timber duckboards, and burying heavy telegraph cables deep enough to survive German shell fire. Living in damp tent camps and ruined farm buildings, the men faced constant exhaustion, frostbite, and the unpredictable thrum of long-range artillery. By early 1917, the Canadian Corps was quietly concentrating its forces around a towering, heavily fortified German stronghold known as Vimy Ridge. Preparing for the upcoming spring offensive required unprecedented engineering feats, including the construction of a vast subterranean network of tunnels, subways, and mining galleries carved deep into the chalk bedrock beneath the battlefield. To support this massive operation, infantrymen and entrenching troops were drafted into specialized labor attachments. On February 14, 1917, Alphonse was temporarily attached to the 172nd Tunneling Company, Royal Engineers in the field, part of the British Expeditionary Force. Working with the Royal Engineers meant stepping out of the mud above and dropping into narrow, claustrophobic wooden-framed shafts deep underground. As a sapper's assistant, Alphonse's work was relentless. He hauled heavy sandbags of excavated chalk out of narrow galleries to prevent German aerial reconnaissance from spotting the tunnel entrances. He drove heavy pit props down into dark, damp shafts to secure the walls against collapse from surface shell strikes. Operating in near total silence, the men worked to avoid alerting German countermining units who were digging their own tunnels just yards away, listening for the telltale thud of a pickaxe before setting off subterranean explosive charges. For nearly a month, Alphonse lived in this subterranean shadow world, helping construct the very tunnels that would safely shelter thousands of Canadian soldiers before they launched their assault on Vimy Ridge. On March 12, 1917, Alphonse ceased his attachment to the Royal Engineers and was transferred back to the 22nd Battalion in the field. Rejoining his comrades above ground, he stepped out of the dark chalk tunnels and into the final tense preparations for the battle that would define the Canadian Corps and bring him face to face with his second major test of survival on the Western Front. By early April 1917, the tensions along the slopes of Vimy Ridge had reached a fever pitch. Having spent the winter hauling underground spoil with the Royal Engineers, Alphonse was now back above ground with the 22nd, taking up position in the assembly trenches. The Allied Grand Assault was scheduled for Easter Monday, April 9th. To prepare for the infantry push, the British and Canadian artillery unloosed a devastating, weeks-long bombardment known as the Week of Suffering, pounding enemy positions with over 1 million shells. The Germans retaliated with fierce, concentrated counter-battery fire, plastering the Canadian staging lines with heavy high explosives and shrapnel. On April 8th, the day before the historic assault went over the top, a shell burst caught Alphonse's position. He was struck down, sustaining severe gunshot and shrapnel wounds to his face, left arm, and thigh. His jaw was shattered. Bleeding and battered, Alphonse was dragged from the muddy trench and rushed through the casualty evacuation chain to No. 13 Stationary Hospital at Ypres on the French coast. His war at Vimy Ridge had ended mere hours before his comrades made their legendary charge up the ridge. The severity of his multiple shrapnel wounds required specialized care in England. Between April 12th and the 14th, Alphonse was struck off strength to the 2nd Quebec Regimental Depot and loaded onto a cross-channel hospital ship. Upon arriving in the United Kingdom, he was transported north and admitted to the 3rd Northern General Hospital in Sheffield. Convalescing in Sheffield, Alphonse faced a long, agonizing recovery as surgeons worked to repair the physical damage to his face, arm, and leg. On paper, he was assigned to the depot administration, but his day-to-day reality was defined by bed rest, dressing changes, and slowly rebuilding his strength, while news arrived from France of the immense casualties suffered by the Vendus across the spring offensive. As his wounds closed and healed, the military medical system moved him through progressive stages of rehabilitation. On June 28th, he was transferred back to the Canadian Convalescent Hospital at Woodcote Park, Epsom, a familiar site from his first wounding in 1916, to begin active physical therapy. A week later, on July 6th, he was discharged from convalescence at Bearwood and reassigned to the 3rd Canadian Command Depot at Shoreham, where recovering soldiers underwent hard physical reconditioning, route marches, and drill to determine if their bodies could still endure frontline service. Having passed his fitness evaluations, Alphonse ceased his attachment to the command depot on August 30th and was transferred to the 10th Reserve Battalion at Shoreham and Seaford. Here he spent the autumn months undergoing refreshed tactical training, gas defense drills, and weapons handling. By late autumn, the Canadian Corps had just endured the horrific mud-choked hell of Passchendaele, leaving unit rosters decimated once again. On November 24th, 19-month veteran Alphonse crossed the English Channel to France for the 3rd time. But the violence of war didn't only take place in the frontline trenches. Just 4 days after returning to France, while billeted behind the lines at Cologne-Ricourt, Alphonse was walking down Rue de Moulins when he was approached by a fellow Canadian soldier asking for a cigarette. When Alphonse replied that he had none, the soldier lunged at him with an open jackknife. Alphonse fought him off, suffering defensive knife slashes across both hands, his right cheek, and his scalp before corporals found him bleeding on the road. His attacker was arrested by military police and court-martialed, while medical officers noted Alphonse was completely without blame. It was a bizarre, violent reminder that danger was everywhere behind the lines. Yet despite the cuts to his face and hands, Alphonse pressed on. Rejoining the 22nd, he stepped back into the freezing mud of the Western Front, carrying the scars of 2 combat woundings and a street brawl, ready to face the final, decisive year of the Great War. As 1918 opened, the character of the First World War changed dramatically. Following the collapse of Russia, the German army launched a massive, desperate spring offensive on the Western Front, shattering years of static trench warfare. The Allied command realized that mobile firepower was the key to surviving and breaking this open warfare. To adapt, the Canadian Corps reorganized its elite automatic weapons unit into dedicated, heavily armed machine gun formations. On April 30th, 1918, Alphonse was transferred from the 22nd to the 2nd Battalion, Canadian Machine Gun Corps. Stepping into the Machine Gun Corps placed Alphonse at the absolute tip of the spear. Operating the heavy Vickers machine gun, his crew was responsible for laying down devastating overhead barrage fire during Allied attacks and anchoring the defense against enemy pushes. Machine gun crews were primary targets for enemy artillery, snipers, and mustard gas, requiring immense technical skill, rapid composure under fire, and physical endurance to drag the heavy, water-cooled guns and brass-belted ammunition through open terrain. As summer turned to autumn, the Canadian Corps was selected as the shock troops for the decisive 100 Days Offensive, the relentless Allied drive that ultimately broke the back of the German army. From August to November of 1918, Alphonse was in the thick of the most intense, fast-moving combat of the entire war. He fought through the Battle of Amiens, where Canadian machine gunners provided mobile fire support to cavalry and armored tanks breaking through the enemy lines. He was there for the breaching of the formidable Drucourt-Queant line, the treacherous canal crossings of Canal du Nord and Cambrai, and the relentless final pursuit toward Mons. By the time the armistice brought the firing to a sudden halt on the morning of November 11, 1918, Alphonse had survived the Somme, Vimy Ridge, and the bloody open warfare of the war's final months. With the fighting over, the massive task of dismantling the Canadian Expeditionary Force began. Alphonse remained with his unit and occupied Europe through the winter until February 4, 1919, when he was transferred from the field back to the Canadian Machine Gun Depot in England. On February 26th, he was struck off strength to the Machine Gun Regiment Depot at Seaford, undergoing medical inspections, gear hand-ins, and final administrative processing. On March 30th, 1919, 2 years and 5 months after he first crossed the Atlantic on the Saxonia, Alphonse boarded sailing number 35 from Liverpool, setting course across the icy North Atlantic for Canada. By April 1919, he was formally demobilized in Canada and handed his official discharge papers. He walked out of the depot as a 21-year-old veteran, carrying multiple combat woundings, a chest full of campaign service, and the heavy, invisible scars of a conflict that had redefined his world. When Alphonse returned home to Canada, he stepped back into a world trying desperately to move on. In 1921, in the northern Ontario town of Iroquois Falls, he married Eleanor Martineau. A year later, in 1922, they welcomed their first child, my grandmother, Olive. Growing up, the war was a shadowy, uninvited guest in the Leroux household. Before she died in 2008, my grandmother Olive told me that Alphonse almost never spoke about his time on the Western Front. On the rare occasions the war was mentioned, it was usually when he had been drinking, and even then, Eleanor would quickly shut it down. She didn't want to hear about it. For a man who had survived the mud of Ypres, the chalk galleries of Vimy, and the tip of the spear in the machine gun corps, the war became a closed book, locked away in the quiet of his own mind. Yet subtle glimpses of his true character broke through the silence. When I shared the details of his 1917 stabbing with my grandmother, how he told the soldier not only that he didn't have a cigarette, but that he should go buy his own, she smiled a quiet, knowing smile. Yes, she told me, that sounds like something he would say. To his grandchildren, Alphonse was a study in contrasts. My youngest aunt, Claudette, remembered a gentle grandfather who held tiny chicks in his hands at the chicken coop so she could pet them, and who gave her a set of Salada T-bird figurines, treasured keepsakes that still sit safely in her curio cabinet today. My Aunt Linda confirmed the memories of the chicken coop and his religious devotion, and my Aunt Diane, the eldest, remembered him as a somewhat distant figure who didn't seem to be around very much. Within his marriage, Alphonse was fiercely protective of Eleanor, calling her ma catine, which means my doll, and refusing to let her work. But that devotion carried an unintended weight. The heavy responsibility of running the household and raising the younger siblings fell entirely on my grandmother. To her brothers and sisters, she became more than just an older sister. She became the de facto mother of the family. The war also took things from Alphonse that left no physical scars. Before he enlisted, he loved to dance. But somewhere in the bloody mud of France or Belgium, he made a solemn vow. If God brought him through the war alive, He would give up dancing forever as a sacrifice. When he came home, he kept that promise, laying down the joy of music and movement on an altar of survival. He spent the rest of his working life as a painter for the Abitibi Paper and Power Company in Iroquois Falls, applying his hands to steady practical labor until he retired. Across his entire life, Alphonse left behind only one direct commentary on the conflict he endured, a piece of family memory passed down through my Aunt Diane, who heard it from her Aunt Yvonne, Alphonse's daughter. She had a print on her wall by E.P. Gartland, an offset lithograph published in 1917 titled Victorious Charge of Canadians at the Battle of Courcelette. It was the battle where the Van Deus won their legendary reputation for tenacious close-quarter fighting. The original print was published in Montreal by Harrington and Barrett, which is how it made its way into the homes of many proud and grieving French-Canadian veterans and families following the war. Looking at that picture, Alphonse turned to his daughter and quietly said, "That was what it was really like." When men like Alphonse returned from the Western Front, there were no grief counselors, no trauma therapy, and no medications to ease the psychological burden. He had been present for some of the most catastrophic and violent milestones in the history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. The expectation of that era was simple and unyielding. You put the war behind you, you kept your head down, and you just got on with your life. For a long time, he remained a nebulous figure to me, just disconnected fragments of memory and a name on a family tree. But this project didn't start in an archive. It started with a fountain pen and brush in my hand. What began as a simple desire to sketch and paint my way into my family's past slowly morphed into something larger. Through every archival document pulled from the darkness, every official military entry, every family story, and every line I've drawn on the page, I've tried to understand him better. I wanted to reach past the silence, step into his world, and shine a light into the darkness he carried. In the end, this project was never just about recording dates or battlefield movements. It was an attempt to pull my great-grandfather back out of the quiet and finally bring the man out of the shadow.